good time. We're just going through the principles of federal prosecution today. We're going to rip through the principles of federal prosecution. If I seem a little distracted, I kicked a hornet's nest today intentionally in a virtual sense. And so now I am dealing with that, but it's been a fun time. It's been honestly a great ride. So, got everything set on silent. Got everything turned off so we won't be disturbed. Let's hop right back into it where we left off. As set forth above, the office concluded that Mr. Trump's conduct violated several federal criminal statutes and that the admissible evidence would be sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction. Right in with the good stuff. Therefore, under the longstanding principles of federal prosecution, the office considered whether, 1, the prosecution would serve, hold on. There we go, about time. I was about to say my stuff wasn't connected for a second. Chat finally kicked in. Let's go. The prosecution would serve a substantial federal interest. 2, Mr. Trump was subject to effective prosecution in another jurisdiction. Or 3, there existed an adequate non-criminal alternative to prosecution. U.S. Department of Justice, Justice Manual 9-27.220, as described below, multiple substantial federal interests were served by Mr. Trump's prosecution. He was not subject to effective prosecution in another jurisdiction, and there was no adequate non-criminal alternative to prosecution. The Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity, handed down after the initial decision to prosecute and analyzed below in Section V.D.2, did not alter the office's view that the principles of federal prosecution compelled prosecuting Mr. Trump. Although that decision prevented use of certain evidence uncovered regarding Mr. Trump's misuse of presidential power, he also engaged in non-immune criminal conduct that is set forth in the superseding indictment. Accordingly, this section discusses only evidence that was not immunized, either because it involved Mr. Trump's private conduct, or because the office would have rebutted any presumption of immunity. Let's see what we got here. Switch it over to follower chat. If you want to hop in, if you want to comment or anything like that, just give us a follow. We appreciate you. We're just going to keep on going. We have Part A of Volume 3, prosecuting Mr. Trump served multiple substantial federal interests. Mr. Trump's prosecution served multiple federal interests, including the federal interest in the integrity of the United States' process for collecting, counting, and certifying presidential elections, and in a peaceful and orderly transition of presidential power. The federal interest in ensuring that every citizen's vote is counted, the federal interest in protecting public officials and government workers from violence, and the federal interest in the fair and even-handed enforcement of the law. All of these federal interests, which are rooted in the law, the Constitution, and our basic democratic values, are substantial and command protection from Mr. Trump's criminal design to subvert them. Damn. Getting into it. So this is Part A, and then we have subsection 1. See how long this goes. It's a decent bit, so let's hop into it. Subsection 1. And we might always hop into some games or something like that, depending on how people are feeling. Feel free to follow along, comment, do that sort of thing as your heart sees fit. Subsection 1. The substantial federal interest in protecting the integrity of the electoral process and the peaceful transfer of power was served by Mr. Trump's prosecution. As set forth above, the investigation revealed that Mr. Trump and others conspired to use false claims of election fraud to attempt to disrupt the United States' electoral process and obstruct the congressional certification of the 2020 presidential election results. Prosecution for that conduct thus vindicated abiding federal interests in protecting the electoral process and the previously unbroken tradition. What is going on with my chat right now? It is like bugging out. That's hilarious. Before Mr. Trump's charged conduct of a peaceful transition of presidential power from one administration to the next. So we're going to read that sentence again because we got bugged out by chat. Prosecution for that conduct thus vindicated abiding federal interests in protecting the electoral process and the previously unbroken tradition before Mr. Trump's charged conduct of a peaceful transition of presidential power from one administration to the next. These federal interests are fundamental to our system of government, favoring no particular administration or political party. Indeed, electoral processes like selecting the president are, quote, necessarily structured to maintain the integrity of the democratic process, end quote. See Burdick, 504 U.S. at 441. Quote, preserving the integrity of the electoral process, end quote, and quote, preventing corruption are interests of the highest importance, end quote. First National Bank of Boston v. Bellotti, C 435 U.S. 765 788 789 in 1978. The office was cognizant of Mr. Trump's free speech rights during the investigation and would not have brought a prosecution if the evidence indicated he had engaged in mere political exaggeration or rough and tumble politics. See Supra, Section 2D, First Amendment defense discussion, Robert Jackson, the federal prosecutor, address delivered at the Second Annual Conference of the United States Attorneys, April 1st, 1940, reference above, quote, in the enforcement of laws that protect our national integrity and existence, we should prosecute any and every act of violation, but only overt acts, not the expression of opinion, or activities such as the holding of meetings, petitioning of Congress, or dissemination of news or opinions, end quote. Emphasis in original. As set forth in the original and superseding indictments, Mr. Trump had, quote, a right like every American to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome determinative voter fraud in the election and that he had won, end quote. That's a good one. We're going to go ahead and snag that and the reference. Because, yeah, you can. You're allowed to say it. You're just not allowed to break the fucking law in order to stay in power, you fucking dickhead. Sorry, I apologize. Moving on. He also had lawful recourse to challenge the election results, including through lawsuits, recounts, and audits. In fact, Mr. Trump and his allies vigorously pursued these methods of contesting the election results, but they were unsuccessful. That's a really big part. You got to have actual evidence, not just fake I feel it evidence. After Election Day, Mr. Trump or his campaign were plaintiffs after Election Day, Mr. Trump or his campaign were plaintiffs or interveners in at least 16 lawsuits seeking to change the outcome of the election, and Mr. Trump's supporters filed dozens of other lawsuits, but all of these failed to change the outcome in any state. Mr. Trump pursued recounts in only 2 states, a statewide machine recount in Georgia and a recount in Wisconsin's Milwaukee and Dane counties. And both served only to confirm the previously reported result. In Wisconsin, the recount increased Mr. Trump's margin of loss. Following public requests, Secretaries of State in Georgia and Michigan ordered additional audits and recounts. In Georgia, a statewide hand recount and an audit in Cobb County, and in Michigan, a statewide audit and a hand recount in Antrim County, sorry, I'm not familiar with those places, where Mr. Trump seized on claims of a clerk's temporary clerical error, but all merely confirmed previously reported results. The conduct of Mr. Trump and co-conspirators, however, went well beyond speaking their minds or contesting the election results through our legal system. Instead, Mr. Trump targeted a key federal government function, the process by which the United States collects, counts, and certifies the results of the presidential election, and sought to obstruct or defeat it through fraud and deceit. He did so using knowingly false claims of election fraud to attempt to induce state officials to reject citizens' votes and instead appoint Mr. Trump's electors, when he deceived his electors and caused them to falsify electoral certificates and submit them to Congress, when he attempted to enlist Mr. Pence with false claims of election fraud and pressure, and when he used and attempted to leverage an angry crowd of his supporters, fueled by Mr. Trump's lies, to stop the certification proceeding. Mr. Trump did this in contravention of the framers' intent to prevent a sitting president from perpetuating himself in power. Quote, in free governments, end quote, Benjamin Franklin explained, quote, the rulers are the servants and the people their superiors and sovereigns, end quote. See the records of the Federal Convention of 1787 at 120. Max Farrand, 1911. Although the framers recognized, quote, the necessity of an energetic executive, end quote, they justified and checked his power by ensuring that he always retained a quote, due dependence on the people, end quote. The Federalist number 70, Alexander Hamilton, see Ciela Law LLC versus Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, 591 U.S. 197 223 224. 2020. As the Supreme Court noted in Trump, quote, the president plays no direct role in the process of appointing electors, nor does he have authority to control the state officials who do. And the framers, wary of cabal, intrigue, and corruption, in another set of quotes, specifically excluded from service as electors, quote, all those who from situation might be suspected of too great devotion to the president in office, end quote. 603 U.S. at 627, 628, quoting the Federalist number 68, Alexander Hamilton and J. Cook, 1961. Accordingly, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution provides that, quote, no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector, end quote. U.S. Constitution, Article 2, 1, 2. The considerable federal interest in protecting the integrity of the United States' electoral process weighed in favor of proceeding with Mr. Trump's prosecution. So, too, did the federal interest in defending from future harm the United States' exceptional tradition of peaceful transitions of presidential power. That tradition was initiated by George Washington when he announced in his September 1796 farewell address that he would decline to seek a third term, followed by John Adams when he relinquished the power of the presidency to his political rival Thomas Jefferson after the election of 1800, and continued by every sitting president until 2020, even through the turbulent Civil War and Reconstruction eras. And Congress and the courts have also recognized the federal interest in orderly presidential transitions. See Presidential Transition Act of 1963, Pub L 88 to 277, 78, Statute 153, 154, to referenced above. Legislation, quote, to promote the orderly transfer of the executive power, end quote, because, quote, any disruption occasioned by the transfer of the executive power could produce results detrimental to the safety and well-being of the United States and its people, end quote. Trump v. Thompson, 20, F. 4th, 10, 1617, D.C. Circuit, 2021. Reference above. Recognizing Congress's, quote, unique legislative need, end quote, for documents, quote, directly relevant to the inquiry into an attack on the legislative branch and its constitutional role in the peaceful transfer of power, end quote. United States v. Tarrio. That's Enrique Tarrio. Recently got that pardon. Now, isn't it fun to see it all come together? 605 F. Sup. 3D 73 78 DDC 2022. Referenced above. When assessing, quote, very serious, end quote, nature and circumstances of a January 6th related offense, court observed that, quote, they involve, among other things, an alleged conspiracy to obstruct the certification of the Electoral College vote and thus to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power, one of our nation's crown jewels. Ooh, we're going to snag that. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, we're just going to get it good. We're just going to get it. We're just going to take it all. We can read it all later. Shorten it down so that way we don't have to go back to page 81. Continuing on. In his first inaugural address, President Ronald Reagan remarked on the country's tradition of peaceful transition of presidential power. To a few of us here today, this is a solemn and most monumentous occasion, and yet, in the history of our nation, it is a commonplace occurrence. The orderly transfer of authority, as called for in the Constitution, routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think about how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as small is nothing less than a miracle. Oh my goodness. Yeah, we're going to snag that one too. Oh my goodness. Oh, how far they have strayed. Inaugural Address, 1981. In connection with preserving that tradition, vice presidents have presided over the certification of their own election losses. In 1961, then Vice President Richard M. Nixon fulfilled his role as President of the Senate at the January 6th certification proceeding, announcing that John F. Kennedy had won the presidency. In so announcing his own defeat, Nixon said, "This is the first time in 100 years that a candidate for the presidency announced the result of an election in which he was defeated and announced the victory of his opponent. I do not think we could have a more striking or eloquent example of the stability of our constitutional system and of our proud tradition of the American people of developing, respecting, honoring institutions of self-government." 107, 291, January 6, 1961, Nixon. Moving on. And in 2001, after a hard-fought legal dispute over the 2000 presidential election, Vice President Al Gore similarly presided over the certification of his opponent, George W. Bush, as president-elect. January 6, 2001, protecting the well-established American tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, weighed in favor of protecting the well-established American tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, weighed in favor of prosecution. So it's important to do it because we've always done it, not because it's an empty tradition or stupid tradition, but because it's an important one. Very interesting. Very interesting. Ooh, they're taking the bait. They're taking the bait on Twitter. Love to see it. All right. This is subsection 2 of part A of volume 3. The substantial federal interest in counting every citizen's vote was served by Mr. Trump's prosecution. Few federal interests are stronger in our representative democracy than that of protecting every eligible citizen's right to vote and to have that vote counted. The evidence establishes that in contravention of that right, Mr. Trump urged state officials to disregard the legitimate majority of votes for Mr. Biden and instead appoint Mr. Trump's electors, pressured and threatened Georgia's Secretary of State to, quote, find, end quote, more than 11,000 votes to dilute the legitimate vote count and allow Mr. Trump to be declared the winner of the state, and urge Mr. Pence to discard the legitimate electoral certificates that reflected millions of citizens' votes in the targeted states. An additional factor meriting Mr. Trump's prosecution, therefore, was the need to vindicate and protect the voting rights of these and all future voters. The strength of the federal interest in protecting the right to vote is plain from the history of suffrage in America, as chronicled in the Constitution, which has been amended not fewer than 5 times to extend and protect the franchise for all adult citizens regardless of race, sex, age, and education. See U.S. Constitution Amendment, what is that, 14, subsection 2? reference above, providing that if a state failed to ensure all eligible citizens the right to vote, the state's proportional representation would be reduced. Nice. So they punished him into doing it. And then 15, section 1, quote, the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, end quote. This is testing me. I don't even know. Another amendment. Same, quote, on account of sex, end quote. Next amendment, same, quote, by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. So just taking away the barriers that they could put in. 26, section 1, same for citizens, quote, who are 18 years of age or older on account of age. So can't discriminate based on that. And a consistent line of court decisions maintaining that suffrage can, quote, can neither be denied outright nor destroyed by alteration of ballots, end quote. Reynolds v. Sims, 377 U.S. 533, 555, 1964. Citations omitted. The strength of the federal interest is further reflected by the history of the Section 241 offense with which Mr. Trump was charged and, as set forth in Section 2C above, by court's universal and longstanding recognition of the right protected by that statute. In attempting to disenfranchise voters who did not choose to reelect him, Trump targeted a bedrock fundamental right that the government has a strong interest in protecting. 3. The substantial federal interest in protecting election officials and other government officials from violence was served by Mr. Trump's prosecution. Another federal interest that merited Mr. Trump's prosecution was addressing his resort throughout the charged criminal conspiracies to threats. That's a fun way to write that. I like that. To threats and encouragement of violence against his perceived opponents. Consistently, when elected officials refused to take improper actions that Mr. Trump urged, like discarding legitimate votes or appointing fraudulent electors, Mr. Trump attacked them publicly on Twitter, a social media application on which he had then 80 million followers. Inevitably, threats and intimidation to these officials followed. For instance, after Mr. Trump targeted a Philadelphia city commissioner in a tweet criticizing the commissioner for stating that there was no evidence of widespread election fraud in Philadelphia, threats against the commissioner grew more targeted, more detailed, and more graphic. These threats extended to include highly personal information like the names and ages of the commissioner's family members, as well as photos or the address of his home. Fulton County, Georgia election officials similarly reported receiving threats, including death threats, following Mr. Trump's false public accusations against Fulton County election workers. Mr. Trump also targeted private citizens who served as election workers. He took particular aim at a mother and daughter who worked at Atlanta's State Farm Arena counting ballots on election day. It's not funny. I shouldn't laugh. I'm sorry. He and his co-conspirators spread pernicious, false claims that these election workers had committed misconduct. Although the lies were promptly and publicly debunked, Mr. Trump continued to repeat them, and the election workers were subjected to vile threats. As one of the women explained, quote, when someone as powerful as the President of the United States eggs on a mob, that mob will come. They came for us with their cruelty, their threats, their racism, and their hats. They haven't stopped even today, end quote. Mr. Trump persisted in publicly spreading false and harmful social media posts about the same election workers in 2023. In 2024, co-conspirator one, Rudy Giuliani, conceded in a defamation lawsuit filed by the election workers that his statements about them were, quote, defamatory per se, end quote, and, quote, false, quote, and a jury awarded them damages of more than $145 million. By the way, what that means is I was lying. That means Rudy Giuliani just said right here, I am a liar. I'm a liar person. I didn't have any evidence. I didn't have anything. I took it to court like you dumb bitches wanted me to. And then what happened? I had to say on the record, oh, I lied about that. I lied. I'm a liar person. That's what that means. That's what he's saying. You might just be too stupid to understand it. Maybe not. If you're here, you're already doing something. I don't think. Hold on. Let me make sure this isn't. Disable low lanes. There we go. Sorry, guys. Had to make sure the stream is all live. Hate to take a break out of nowhere, but got to get it done. Got to make sure you can still hear us, still see us, because we're just going to upload everything to YouTube anyway. Whoa. Sorry. Anybody who's looking on stream. People message me wild stuff on Twitter, so don't look at that. Look at me. We're reading through the J. Oh, it's gonna be a wild time. If you want to see the stuff that happens on Twitter, like, comment, subscribe, follow, all the things to see more, and I will open it up to that. But right now, I'm doing that by myself. I'm just reading through the Jack Smith report here. Mr. Trump took aim at Mr. Pence, and Mr. Pence repeatedly informed Mr. Trump that he could not, in good conscience, do as Mr. Trump asked. On January 6th, this included Mr. Trump's retributive targeting of Mr. Pence during his ellipse speech and the 224 tweet attacking Mr. Pence that Mr. Trump issued, even though he knew that the riot was ongoing at the Capitol. So he's still tweeting while it's going on, saying Pence is bad or something like that. We'll see if it has something out. Mr. Pence, attacking Mr. Pence, ongoing at the Capitol. Taken together, these actions resulted in rioters at the Capitol on January 6th singling out Mr. Pence for their ire and chanting, "Where is Pence? Bring him out." And, quote, "Hang Mike Pence," end quote. The first one was a quote as well. Gotta love it. In addition to prompting these threats against the targets of Mr. Trump's criticisms, Mr. Trump's words inspired his supporters to commit acts of physical violence. On January 6th, Mr. Trump used his ellipse speech to direct his supporters to, quote, "Go to the Capitol," end quote, and, quote, "Fight like hell," end quote. He explicitly licensed them not long after Rudy Giuliani had exhorted the crowd to engage in, quote, "trial by combat," end quote, to operate under, quote, "very different rules," end quote, because fraud was allegedly involved. And he told them they were, quote, "not going to let it happen," end quote, urging them to stop the election certification proceeding that was about to begin. The people who took Mr. Trump at his word formed a massive crowd that broke onto restricted Capitol grounds and into the building, violently attacking law enforcement officers protecting the Capitol and those inside. Officers have described being assaulted by rioters wielding bear spray, metal bats, and flagpoles, and other improvised weapons. A Metropolitan Police Department, MPD, commander recounted that the scene was, quote, "a nonstop barrage of just strikes with weapons and things being thrown and pepper spray and you name it. Everything being hurled at these officers. You could hear them yelling. You could hear them screams and moans and everything else," end quote. Multiple officers stated that they feared for their lives when among the rioters that day. One MPD officer put that fear at, quote, 100%, end quote, from the moment he entered the crowd, and he explained that he thought he might die. Quote, "You know you're getting pushed, kicked, you know people are throwing metal bats at you and all that stuff. I was like, yeah, this is fucking it," end quote. Can't even imagine, bro. A U.S. Capitol Police officer similarly recalled thinking, quote, "I think I might die today," end quote. And in one instance, an MPD officer recounted that rioters dragged him into the crowd where they beat him and tased him while yelling things like, "I got one," quote, "I got one," end quote, and, quote, "kill him with his gun," end quote. Lit. Oh my God, that's awful. I gotta stop laughing. I can't wipe the smile off of it. This is just insane that this is just out here in the record and people just won't engage with this at all. I'm gonna see if I can get the dipshit on Twitter to do this. The January 6 rioters assaulted at least 140 law enforcement officers that day, and at least 123 defendants have been charged with using a deadly or dangerous weapon, or causing serious bodily injury to law enforcement. This violence took a lasting toll. In addition to significant physical injuries inflicted that day, officers suffered, quote, unseen injuries, quote, end quote, including depression and other forms of psychological trauma. Officers at the Capitol understood that if the rioters reached the lawmakers and other staff inside the building, violence would have been done to them as well. Only through the heroism of the law enforcement officers who defended the Capitol were lawmakers and their staff protected from harm. Many members of Congress feared for their lives. Once the rioters breached the Capitol building, quote, elected representatives, congressional staff, and members of the press hid in terror from the mob, end quote, in barricaded offices or unmarked rooms as rioters roamed the hallways. United States v. Crestman, so probably one of the Proud Boys, or at least one of the J6ers, for instance, detailing his efforts to evacuate a U.S. senator. For instance, in detailing his efforts to evacuate a U.S. senator and her staff from an unmarked hiding spot, one U.S. Capitol police officer described the senator as, quote, afraid for her life, end quote, shaking, end quotes, and, quote, very, very, she was scared, end quote. He added that the senator later relayed to him that what the rioters did on January 6th had, quote, scared and frightened everybody, end quote, and had, quote, put a lot of people's lives in danger, end quote. The violence on January 6th was foreseeable to Mr. Trump, who had remarked just the evening before that his supporters were, quote, angry, end quote, and who, to cheers of, quote, invade the Capitol building, end quote, and, quote, take the Capitol, end quote, had told those supporters during his ellipse speech to, quote, show strength, end quote, and to, quote, be strong, end quote. When he told them, quote, we're not going to let it happen, the crowd chanted, quote, when he told them, quote, we're not going to let that happen, end quote, the crowd chanted, quote, fight for Trump, end quote. It's pretty clear to me, but I guess we got to keep going. And when he warned his gathered supporters that, quote, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, end quote, the crowd marched to the Capitol in response. Indeed, officials and advisors close to Mr. Trump recognized and voiced their concerns over this high potential for election-related violence. On January 4th, a senior advisor explicitly warned co-conspirator 2, John Eastman, that if Mr. Pence unilaterally rejected legitimate electoral votes, it would cause, quote, riots in the streets, end quote. John Eastman replied that there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. Holy shit. Let's go ahead and get that one. And we're going to get republic as well. What? It didn't even get the right one. All right, let's see if we can do it again. We're getting there, guys. Don't worry. Boom. We're getting there. On January 5th, after Mr. Trump told Mr. Pence that he would have to publicly criticize him, Mr. Pence's chief of staff was sufficiently concerned for Mr. Pence's safety that he had alerted the head of the vice president's protective detail. And a counsel to the vice president issued a prescient warning to John Eastman the same day when he warned that the conspirators' plan would result in a, quote, disastrous situation, quote, where the election might, quote, have to be decided in the streets, end quote. Indeed, as the riot at the Capitol unfolded on January 6th, the vice president's counsel chided John Eastman that, quote, whipping large numbers of people into a frenzy over something with no chance of ever attaining legal force through actual process of law has led us to where we are. My goodness, end quote. Holy shit. Sorry, I should stop doing that. Can't react and then say end quote. say end quote, and then react. What are you going to do? All right. There is unquestionably a public interest in pursuing that elected officials and election workers can carry out their duties without fear of threats of retaliation. From memorandum from Lisa Monaco, Deputy Attorney General, guidance regarding threats against election workers, blah, 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 2021, referenced above. Quote, the right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy, the right from which all other rights ultimately flow. For this vital right to be effective, election officials must be permitted to do their jobs free from improper partisan influence, physical threats, or any other conduct designed to intimidate, end quote. Accordingly, the need to promote this federal interest weighed in favor of proceeding against Mr. Trump. Part 4. The substantial federal interest in the even-handed administration of the law was served by Mr. Trump's prosecution. Sip of water. Hold on, give me 1 second. I'm going to take a quick little be right back. Nothing crazy. I'll be back in one hot second. I just got to respond to these. I'm just trying to goad them on. Sorry. I'll be right back. I just gotta, like, the people on Twitter, they're saying some wild stuff, but it's just so easy to, like, goad them on. All right. Sorry. I just gotta, like, I gotta rip them. Like, it's simply just too much fun. I really do apologize. But hopping right back on, because ain't nothing wrong with a little bit of that. We're right back. Ain't nothing wrong with that. There is a substantial federal interest in ensuring the even-handed administration of the law with respect to accountability for the events of January 6, 2021, and the office determined that interest would not be satisfied absent Mr. Trump's prosecution for his role. Multiple district court judges have recognized Mr. Trump's role in the events of January 6. See United States v. Lolos, LOLOS. Number 21 CR 242 ECF number 37 at 5556 DDC November 19th 2021 transcript of sentencing. Referenced above. Court stating that January 6th defendant was, quote, called to Washington, D.C. by an election official. He was prompted to walk to the Capitol by an elected official. Why am I missing these quotes? I really do apologize. I'm starting that reference again. Court stating that January 6th defendant was, quote, called to Washington, D.C. by an election official. He was prompted to walk to the Capitol by an election official, end quote, and telling defendant, quote, I think you were a pawn in a game that was played and directed by people who should have known better, end quote. United States v. Peterson, number 21, CR 309, ECF, number 32, at the 23, DDC, December 1st, 2021, transcript of sentencing, reference above. Court stating that, quote, incendiary, end quote, statements at the Ellipse rally, quote, absolutely, quite clearly and deliberately stoked the flames of fear and discontent and explicitly encouraged those at the rally to go to the Capitol and fight for one reason and one reason only, to make sure the certification did not happen. My goodness. Let's go ahead and grab that. I know none of it can be used now, but we're going to have it. United States v. Barnard, number 21, CR 235, ECF, number 53 at 28 DDC, February 24th, 2022. Transcript of sentencing. Quote, the events of January 6 involved a rather unprecedented confluence of events spurred by then President Trump and a number of his prominent allies who bear much responsibility for what occurred on that date. To date, more than 1,500 people have been criminally charged for their roles in the January 6 attack on the United States Capitol. All got pardoned. What? Trash. With that in mind, Mr. Trump's relative culpability weighed heavily in favor of charging him as the individual most responsible for what occurred at the Capitol on January 6th. See Justice Manual 9-27.230.4 referenced requiring prosecutors to assess, quote, to assess the, quote, degree of the person's culpability in connection with the offense, both in the abstract and in comparison with any others involved in the offense, end quote. Rioters have cited Mr. Trump as the reason they traveled to Washington, D.C. and went to the Capitol that day. In the weeks before January 6, Mr. Trump issued several tweets calling his supporters to Washington, D.C. for his rally at the Ellipse, and they answered the call. In the days after Mr. Trump's December 19th tweet promising that the rally would be, quote, wild, end quote, for instance, Kelly Meggs, a member of the Oath Keepers group, who was later convicted of seditious conspiracy, among other charges, messaged associates that, quote, it's going to be wild. Trump wants us to make it wild. That's what he's saying, end quote. United States v. Rhodes, number 22, CR 15, ECF, number 815, at 61, DDC, February 21st, 2024, motion hearing, blah. Meggs added, quote, he called us all to the Capitol. He wants us to make it wild, end quote, at 61 and 62. Rioter David Koontz, a member of the Three Percenters militia group, who would later plead guilty to charges related to breaching the Capitol building, planned travel to Washington, D.C. on January 6 in direct response to the December 19th tweet. United States v. Wilson, number 23, CR 427, ECF, number 47, at 6 and 7, DDC, April 17th, 2024, superseding indictment. Koontz later shared Trump's December 27th tweet, which told supporters, quote, see you in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Don't miss it. Information to follow, end quote. Koontz commented, quote, he is asking us to be there, end quote, and, quote, good, he does need us. I'm sick, going armed, period. I don't know what they have there. That'd be interesting to see what that actually was referenced. It might be like some, jargon, lingo, something like that, that they didn't want to translate over. I'm not sure. Wilson, number 23, C also, Wilson, number 23, CR 427, ECF, number 95 at 8, DDC, December 2nd, 2024, statement of offense. Moving on. In his Ellipse speech, Mr. Trump explicitly directed his supporters to march on the Capitol. At one point, in reply to a line in his speech that, quote, we will not let them silence your voices. We're not going to let that happen. End quote. A portion of the rally crowd chanted, quote, fight for Trump, end quote. When he repeatedly exhorted his supporters to, quote, walk down, quote, end quote, to the U.S. Capitol to prevent Congress's planned certification, they listened. Law enforcement witnesses at and near the Capitol on January 6 described large crowds descending upon Capitol grounds from the direction of the Ellipse rally. And video and photographic evidence shows that hundreds of individuals in attendance at the Ellipse rally were later participants in the Capitol siege and in some cases were among the most violent of the rioters. During the siege, Mr. Trump's supporters continued to heed his words. Video evidence from that afternoon shows rioters in real time crediting Mr. Trump for their presence and conduct at the Capitol. For example, as the crowd sought to push past officers protecting the Capitol's east front, one rioter shouted, quote, we were invited here. We were invited by the President of the United States, end quote. Inside, another rioter yelled at officers to, quote, stand down, you're outnumbered, there's a fucking million of us out there, and we're listening to Trump, your boss, end quote. United States v. Harris, number 21, CR 189, ECF, number 84, at 5, DDC, October 20th, 2023. The rioter was later convicted of obstruction and of assaulting an officer, among other violations. As the day wore on, rioters continued to obey Mr. Trump's commands. At 4:25, just 8 minutes after Mr. Trump's video tweet, telling supporters that they were, quote, very special, end quote, but should, quote, go home now, end quote, rioter Edward Vallejo, I don't give a shit, a member of the Oath Keepers, posted to a group signal chat that, quote, our commander-in-chief has just ordered us to go home, end quote. Rhodes, ECF, number 822 at 55, sentencing hearing. Another rioter, Jacob Chansley, played that video tweet to a crowd at the Capitol and announced that, quote, Donald Trump has asked everybody to go home, end quote. Chansley left the Capitol at that point, having earlier breached the Senate chamber, taken a seat at the dais, and declared Vice President Pence to be a, quote, fucking traitor, or, quote, a fucking traitor, end quote. Sorry. United States v. Chansley, number 21, CR 3, ECF, number 81, at 1011, DDC, November 9th, 2021. Government sentencing memorandum, I think. Yeah, that's probably it. We probably got about 10, 15 more minutes, and then I got to go fight with some idiots on Twitter. I'm pretty... he never got back to me. Never mind. We can keep on pushing as long as I can go. After January 6th, when rioters began to face accountability for their unlawful acts at the Capitol, many pointed to Mr. Trump in an attempt to excuse or mitigate their conduct. For example, following his arrest on charges stemming from the Capitol siege, rioter Alex Harkrider sought release from pretrial detention by arguing that, quote, like thousands of others at the Capitol, Mr. Harkrider was responding to the entreaties and then to the entreaties of the then commander-in-chief, former President Donald Trump. Too many T's. Today, Junior. United States v. Harkrider, number 21, CR 117, ECF, number 16, at 14, DDC, April 1st, JK Lowell's 2021. Defendant's motion to revoke order of detention. See also United States v. Hale Cusinelli, number 21, CR 37, ECF, number 13, at 17, DDC, March 2nd, 2021. Defendant's motion for modification of bond, wherein referenced requesting pretrial release in part because defendant, quote, was responding to entreaties of the then commander-in-chief, President Trump, end quote. So he used this as a defense. They told me to do it, and then they go back and say, oh, you didn't tell me to do it. It's just, you want it all the ways. It didn't work this way, so I guess you're not getting it both ways, but, like, you want it. You want your cake, you want to eat it too, and you don't want to have a fat ass. I can't understand your way of thinking. I can't. Well, I can. You're stupid. You're stupid people, so it's okay. But tune in, like, comment, subscribe. We really appreciate you. Chansley, number 21, CR 3, ECF, number 12, at 10, DDC, February 23rd, 2021. Motion of defendant for pretrial release, arguing that Chansley was, quote, incited, end quote, by Mr. Trump and noting his unsuccessful request for a presidential pardon. In closing argument at trial on seditious conspiracy and other charges related to January 6th, defense counsel unsuccessfully asked the jury to acquit Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio because, in part, quote, it was Mr. Trump's anger that caused what occurred on January 6th, end quote, and, quote, it was not Enrique Tarrio, end quote. Just no one's to blame. It just happened. It just happened. United States v. Nordine et al., number 21, CR 175, trial at 19,991, DDC, April 25th, 2023. And at sentencing in January 6 cases, many rioter defendants, whether expressing remorse or not, have sought leniency by blaming Mr. Trump both for their presence at the Capitol and their underlying belief, quote, that the 2020 presidential election was fraudulent and that they must take action to stop the transition of the presidency, end quote. United States v. Palmer, number 21 CR 328 ECF, number 31 at 8 DDC, December 13th, 2021. Sentencing memorandum and motion for downward variance. See also United States v. McCarthy, 21 CR 40 ECF, number 528 at 2 DDC, February 17th, 2023. Defendant David Mahaffey's sentencing statement. United States v. Grupo. Defendant's letter citing language of Ellipsis rally speech and stating, quote, "I trusted the president and that was a big mistake," end quote. Goddamn right it was, dipshit. All right, we have made it down to part B. Made it all the way past A, and we are in part B. And then C's not long after. So I think we should be able to rip the rest of this real quick. We are at part C. In the final stretch, we're gonna finish up volume 3, part C, ripping through it now. There was no adequate non-criminal alternative to prosecution. So basically, at least from what it says by that, they had to do it because there's no other legitimate way that this person wouldn't do it again, and I think we're seeing that now. Maybe not directly, but I think we'll be seeing it here soon. The attitudes that caused this to be in the Overton window of what they thought was possible or permissible is the same thing that's going to have them do it again. So that's what we're preparing for on this channel. If you want, tune in. Given the strong federal interest in holding Mr. Trump accountable described above, the office could not identify any adequate non-criminal alternative to prosecution. To be sure, because he was president at the time of the alleged offenses, Mr. Trump was subject to impeachment and was in fact impeached, though he was not convicted. Impeachment, however, was never intended to be a substitute for a criminal prosecution, or for criminal prosecution in general. Quote, "The framers recognized that most likely there would be two sets of proceedings for individuals who commit impeachable offenses, the impeachment trial and a separate criminal trial," end quote. Nixon v. United States. Holy shit. Holy shit. Is that, holy shit. That's huge. I'm sorry for cussing or whatnot, but holy shit. Did anybody just hear that? We're going to rip that again. So this is from Nixon v. United States, 506 U.S. 224, 234, 1993. We're probably going to go take a look at this just cause. Put a star by that just for shits and giggles, just because I can. My goodness. The framers recognized that most likely there would be two sets of proceedings for individuals who commit impeachable offenses, the impeachment trial and a separate criminal trial.